Isaiah 46, verses 3 to 10.
Listen to me, descendants of Jacob.
All you who remain in Israel.
I have cared for you since you were born.
And have carried since you were born.
I will be your God throughout your lifetime,
until your hair is white with age. I made you, and I will care for you.
I will carry you along and save you.
With whom will you compare me or count me equal?
Some people pour out their silver and gold and hire a craftsman to make a god from it.
Then they bow down and worship it.
They lift it to their shoulders and carry it.
And when they set it down, it stays there. It can't even move.
And when someone prays to it, there is no answer.
It can't rescue anyone from trouble.
Do not forget this.
Do not forget this.
Do not forget this. Keep it in mind.
Remember this, you guilty ones. Remember the things I have done in the past.
I am God, and there is no other.
I am God.
I am God.
I am God, and there is none like me.
Only I can tell you the future.
Before it even happens.
Everything I plan will come to pass.
For I do whatever I wish.
Thank you so much for Janine, who led us in prayer, and for all those who shared in that Bible reading. I actually love hearing those Bible readings, and I know the people who put them together behind the scenes do a fantastic job. I trust that you do as well. It's great to hear different people in our church community participate and read God's Word together. There are a couple of things I need to say this morning before we hit the sermon today. Firstly, in the announcements before, I was meant to give you a bit of an update on winter shelter. As you can imagine, the lockdown again causes problems, again, with how we try to facilitate winter shelter. And unfortunately, last week, we've had to take the tough decision to hit pause again on our overnight accommodation for the guests who have been sleeping rough. We've done this in conjunction with one of our local support groups, Wesley Uniting, and they've been able to place people. And also there's been a government program running called Homelessness to Home, which has actually been putting people under cover and in a safe place of shelter every night. So that's been fantastic. But the organisation for Winter Shelter will continue to care for those who are most in need in our community. And so we're going to pivot again to providing meals. This will be done on a regular basis, both through a takeaway environment, but also, again, through shared meals when we have that capacity. So if you want to participate in that, and you've been part of those teams in the past, well, I'm sure that Gitta will be in touch with you, or if not, you could be in touch with her. You could just send a note to her at gitta.clayton@chbc.org.au, and she would love to hear from you as well. You know, it's a bit of an unusual thing being a regular preacher to a church community. Frankly, at times it feels unbalanced, and even more so in these times of online church, because it feels unbalanced because it's often a one-way conversation. It's not a dialogue. And there are times when it feels like you know more about my life as I share stories than I do about yours. Now, this is kind of a roundabout way for me to express my gratitude and my thanks to the many people who reached out to me after last week. If you were tuning in last week, I expressed some of my weariness, as many of you have felt weary at the time. And obviously, by the sounds of it, I must have looked very weary as well. But I want to say thank you for so many people that reached out to me. It did feel extremely strange beginning a series on relationships with no one here physically to relate to. It was just kind of weird. And so, kind of as a consequence of that, and also partly because of, I believe, the importance of the material, and we had a number of guest speakers lined up, we believe that to function in the way that it would best work, it required people to be as much physically present as possible. So we've decided to hit pause on that. However, I do want to say that the subject, and not just the subject, but the living of relationships is incredibly important. Life, church, community are not spectator events. We need to participate and sharing them together. As I expressed before, people reached out to me last week when I was feeling a bit flat and a bit weary. Can I implore you, can I ask you, request, demand, if it be that way, that you reach out to others as well, people that maybe you sense might be struggling, maybe who need a call or a text or something like that. Can I ask you as much as I can to do that? Because that's part of what it is to be a community together. what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to cycle back and continue our series on Isaiah. We were about probably 60%, 2/3 of the way through Isaiah. And so we're going to continue doing that until we can feel like we've got a clear space to be able to engage in the relationships and other kind of series plans that we have for the rest of the year. Where we left Isaiah, if you have been along with us with this journey, is that reminding ourselves that the nation of Israel in the 7th and 8th century through to the 6th century BC had been taken away in captivity by the Babylonians into a foreign land. They had done so partly as being a consequence of their rebelliousness against God. And for the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah, it's a message which is predominantly one of judgment. It's a harsh message. It says you have rebelled against God and you will receive the consequences of your behaviour. But the book switches gear in Isaiah chapter 40. It switches gear from kind of this sort of despairing notion to, first of all, in Isaiah chapter 40, a theme of comfort and care. And then also, as we continue through these chapters, a real sense of hope and where that hope is going to continue to come from. So that's where we kind of left it in Isaiah chapter 42 and when Ben and Matt preached a few weeks ago. This past week, can I ask you, have you had a conversation which has gone something like this? How many cases were overnight? Were they community cases or were they cases in quarantine? 14. Is that a good number or is that a bad number? How many cases were there in Sydney overnight? Do you think that will ever be released from lockdown or not? You had a conversation like that? I imagine that you have. And I think as a consequence of those conversations, as a consequence of those events that drive that, we have been continually living a life, living each day filled with uncertainty. This uncertainty that we feel leads to these feelings of anxiety, concerns about what tomorrow will bring, with this massive disruption to life that we've experienced. How do we try to cope? How do we even, in a sense, try to thrive in this environment? I suspect that myself, like yourself, our natural instinct during these times is to seek to kind of reach to look out for security. It's that sense of like walking along a wobbly rope bridge, feeling the uncertainty under our feet, and we reach and grab out for something for dear life, something that will hold us tight. And so if we worry about having a job, being able to pay the bills, we reach out and we hold on tight to the bank account. Maybe we worry about our health. Will we get a jab or no jab? So we hang on to our physical well-being. Or maybe we're anxious about being alone. So we cling onto the relationships we have or we fall apart. And the truth is that during uncertain times, each one of us will turn to something to sustain us during this time of uncertainty. You know, the nation of Israel experienced many of these same anxieties and fears. They had also been ripped out of their normal life, captured by a foreign power, removed from everything that was a part of their normal daily life, all the things that were familiar, the places, the people, the rhythms of life that were the things that they kind of counted on. And now their life was uncertain. The bridge of life was wobbly. So where would they turn to? What would sustain them during uncertain times? Away from their home, they looked at all the things, all the people, all the life that surrounded them, and saw the locals who found their sustenance, their life in their local gods and idols. The idols were the source of life. They were the source of certainty about the future and blessings in their daily life. And I've got to say, as the Israelites found, so do we also found. When we live a life surrounded by all sorts of different idols, it's very hard very hard not to get caught up in all that surrounds us. It's difficult to swim against the current of society. And so, of course, in the time of Israel in Babylon, they got caught up in the tides that surround them. And into this space, into this time and place, the prophet Isaiah speaks. As was read to us early on in verse 3, it declares, it says, "Listen to me, descendants of Jacob, all of you who remain in Israel, both those who are in captivity and those who are in their home place." He says this, you know what it is like trying to get the attention of people, don't you? You know what it's like. When someone is kind of like staring you in the eye, but they're not engaged, and you want to say, "Listen to me. Get your eyes focused here." Maybe they're reading a book, checking out their phone, watching a movie, and they're kind of half listening, but not fully engaged. And here the prophet is calling out to them, "Listen to me." And you know that environment when you're in a large room, much like myself, except in contrast, it's filled with people. And when it's filled with people, you know, you hear that kind of that level of the noise rise, and there's kind of some laughter from over there, and there's a hub of chatter over there and stuff like that. And you feel like you've got to elevate your voice. You've got to raise the volume that you have to get people's attention. And I think that's what Isaiah is doing here. He's saying, "Listen to me. Your eyes have been focused on a million distracting things that surround you. Now pay attention. You've been listening to all the voices that are surrounding you in this ear, behind you. Now listen to me. Think about what's going on. Don't just get swept up in the social current that surrounds you." The prophet knows that the nation has been casting its eyes towards the idols of Babylon. And so a story begins to speak to this. In fact, it's a story that's been building for a few chapters. In chapter 45, if you've got a Bible with you and you flipped it to the previous chapter, Isaiah declares that every knee will bow down towards God. In verse 23, "I have sworn by my own name, I have spoken the truth, I will never go back on my word. Every knee will bend to me. Every tongue will declare allegiance to me." But in many ways, that doesn't make sense in the current environment. How can that be that every knee will bow down towards the living God when the idols of Babylon sit loud and proud, high and mounted in the world that surrounds them? Well, the story has been building about their demise. In Isaiah chapter 44, you can read in the middle part of it from kind of verse 24 onwards, it begins to tell the story of the conquering king, the conquering Persian king Cyrus, how he begins to be launched on his dazzling career. And now a central role in his story will emerge. You see, Cyrus will bring about the fall of Babylon. History records the events, and we're given front row seats as the great gods of Babylon topple from their pedestals, lie prone on the wagons that then unceremoniously cart them off. In verse 1 of the chapter that we read earlier on, it says this, it says that Bel and Nebo, the gods of Babylon, bow as they are lowered to the ground. They are being hauled away on ox carts. The poor beasts stagger under the weight. Both the idols and their owners are bowed down. The gods cannot protect the people. The people cannot protect the gods. They go off into captivity together. Here, Cyrus and his victories are in view. Isaiah names the two great gods of Babylon. Bel is Marduk. That's the chief god of Babylon. Nebo is Bel's son in the Babylonian pantheon. You can see the significance, for example, of Nebo's name in the name of kings like Nebuchadnezzar, who are named after him. Nebo was the god of wisdom. And one of the events that was part of kind of like the mythology around Nebo was that every year he was carried to Babylon to accompany his father in the New Year processions. And in that they would write on the tables of destiny what the coming year held for Babylon. But now we read a different story. Instead of being carted towards Babylon, he is dragged off. They're lowered from their position of power, taken away, dragged down from their prominence, placed on the back of animals. They are bundled off, first in flight from Cyrus, and then carried off to captivity. You see, what was once held high is now brought low. Once was all-powerful, now is impotent. And not only that, what seemingly was the power of these idols, the seemingly was the power of these gods, it becomes a burden. The animals that carry them off are tired by the weight that they are. You see, the idols cannot carry the people. In defeat, they must be carried themselves. They become a liability. And Isaiah is saying to the people of Israel here, what sort of God is this? What sort of God is this that once was high and now is brought low? What sort of God is this that is a burden to animals? What sort of God requires people to carry around because it is impotent? Listen to me, you descendants of Jacob, all of you who remain in Israel. I have cared for you since before you were born. And you ready for this? I have carried you before you were born. I will be your God throughout your lifetime, till your hair is white with age. I made you, I will care for you, and I will carry you along and save you. You see, God reminds them, I have cared for you. How long? Not for 5 minutes, not for 5 years. I carried you before you were born. You know, these are two of my favourite photos ever. I'm sure that you can guess where they're from. I'm reminded of them whenever I'm having a disagreement with my children. I loved you before you were born. You know, your friends may come and go, but I have loved you before you even appeared physically on this earth. And here we're reminded by God that birth is bookended by white hair. I have carried you before you were born, and I will continue to do so until you die. The Babylonian gods have been brought low. They require to be carried. And in contrast, I carry you. I care for you. I have saved you. You can read it, can't you? This is a reminder of the very nature of who God is. This is a reminder of the incomparable God. The incomparable God. The passage is this dramatic contrast between the true living eternal God versus the gross inadequacies of the idols that are put up instead. To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? Some people pour out their silver and gold. Some hire a craftsman to make a god from it. Then they bow down and worship it. They carry it around on their shoulders, and when they set it down, it stays there. It can't even move. When someone prays to it, there is no answer. It can't rescue anyone from trouble. Some people, they pour out their silver and gold and hire a craftsman to make a god from it. Humans always seem to make idols from gold and silver, precious stones, because we believe that they need to be beautiful. But the true living God is the one who made the substances these idols are crafted from. You see, the living God is no man-made idol. The living God is no man-made idol. And this is the message that Isaiah declares to the people. You've been placing your hope in a man-made substance. You've been placing your hope on something that has been brought down and become a burden. Now you need to be reminded, turn to me, for I am the one who has carried you. I am the one who has carried you from before you were born until your hair turns white. It's the message that we need to hear today as well, isn't it? For while this message was delivered to a nation more than 2,500 years ago, it still rings true to us today. Listen. Listen. Think. Think. Pay attention is what it's declaring. Who is the true living God? You know, we also live in a world that is so easy to get swept along by the currents of our society. We are bombarded with advertising every minute of every day. It used to be when I was growing up, it was radio and it was TV. Now it's social media. It drips into our minds and heads consistently. It wears away at us. And advertising and marketing people are smart. They are clever. They seek to convince us that the answers for life are found in a product. And it's difficult not to be attracted by the bright lights and those shiny products. And much like the Israelites of old were attracted by the silver and gold. We are surrounded by social influencers and media and anyone with a loud enough voice who wants to convince us that their worldview, that their advice will solve life's challenges and problems. Let's be honest, we live in a noisy world, but we still need to listen to what is the voice of the living God. You think about what your idols might be. The things that you hold on to, the things that in times of uncertainty we reach out to grab because we hope that they will sustain us and keep us secure. Our idols may not be made of silver and gold, but they're still superficially attractive. Like the Babylonian idols, though, they are ultimately useless. They cannot move. They don't answer prayer. They are silent. If we could just stop, if we could just hit pause and pay attention and think and listen, we quickly realize that the answers that we often swallow don't really solve any of the big issues of life. They're more like a couple of Panadol tablets, giving us temporary relief from the headaches of life without dealing with the underlying issues. The problem with the Babylonian gods was that they promised something and were unable to deliver. They were brought low and became a burden. And the same thing is the truth with many of the idols and gods that we reach for to sustain us. They cannot deliver, and they're brought low. So what then does the prophet ask us to do? What then does the Bible kind of guide us towards? Listen, think, then it says remember. Remember. Remember the things I have done in the past, for I alone am God. I am God, and there is no one like me, it declares. You see, for the nation of Israel, this was a reminder of the God who brought them out of slavery into a new promised land, a reminder of the God that they worshipped. Where the Babylonian gods were carried around by the people do not carry Yahweh. He was the one who bore them. He was the one who had always carried them. Remember what God has done. And I would say the same for myself, and I would say it to you. Remember what God has done. Remember. And not only remember, because life does not stay in the past, He gives us a promise about what the future is. You see, the verbs that are used here in this text go from this past of repeating and underlining over and over again that he has been the God who carries people. And now, dramatically at the end of verse 4, it comes to a new idea that the God of history not only has carried them, but also he rescues and delivers them. Only I, it can tells you in verse 10, only I can tell you the future before it even happens. Everything I plan will come to pass, for I do whatever I wish. It cycles on to verse 13, for I am ready to set things right. Not in the distant future, but right now. I am ready to save Jerusalem and show my glory to Israel. Whereas the first half of the chapter focused on the failings of the Babylonian idols, now we're reminded about the sovereignty, the control of the living God. I am ready to set things right. In fact, Yahweh declares that this is what he will do. It doesn't matter what you think. Listen to me, you stubborn people who are so far from doing right. It's an expression to say you have been headstrong, so focused on your own situation, but God is ultimately in control. In fact, this is an exchange that has been carrying on for a little bit. If you flip back to the previous chapter, in chapter 45, this is an exchange of questions that were asked. In verse 9 it says, what sorrow awaits those who argue with their Creator? Does a clay pot argue with its maker? Does the clay dispute the one who shapes it, saying, stop, you're doing it wrong? Does the pot exclaim, how clumsy can you be? How terrible would it be if a newborn baby said to its father, why was I born? Or if it said to its mother, why did you make me this way? This is a clear message. In a sense, you shouldn't actually be querying God because God is the sovereign maker. You know, the beauty here is we have this twin picture of God. We have this picture of God who is the one who is sovereign, whose plans will not be pushed aside. But it's partnered with this message of the God who carries and cares. That's a God that we can put our trust and hope in. A sovereign God, a compassionate God. It's a God I implore you to put your hope and trust in. It's a God that I implore you to, when life is wobbly, to reach out, to grab a hold of. I want to say to you today, this is the God that allows us to rest easy in uncertain times. Because what God says he will do, he will do. The promise for the Israelites was that hope and rescue was coming. King Cyrus would wipe away the Babylonian Empire. Israel would be returned to its homeland. That was the immediate rescue that was part of their journey. The promise for us is a God who is sovereign, who holds this world in his hands. The circumstances that surround us in life, God is not surprised by them. God's plans will not be pushed aside. He is sovereign. You know, recently I was reminded that the most valued character trait in leaders was honesty. And it wasn't just honesty, it was honesty expressed in the idea that a leader that you can trust will do what they say they will do. And when I think of that character trait from God, and that gives me even more hope. It gives me more certainty. Because God will do what he says he will do. Babylonian idols might be brought down low and carted off, but the living God remains. For me, that gives me peace each day for the world that we live in, because God will do what he says he will do. Listen to me, you stubborn people, he declared to the Israelites who are so far from doing right. I'm ready to set things right, not in the distant future, but right now. I'm ready to save Jerusalem and show my glory to Israel. For God alone is the unchanging God. God alone is the burden-bearing God who carries us. God alone is the I am, the one who was, who is, and forevermore will be. In verse 9 it declares, "For I alone am God. I am God and there is none like me. Only I can tell you the future before it ever happens. Everything I plan will come to pass, for I do what I wish." You see, God is never surprised, never disheartened, never wrong. That's something that we can hold on to. The idols that look good, clad in silver and gold, promise but never deliver. They do not move. They do not carry. They do not answer prayer. I want to say to each one of you today that as we live in the uncertainty of life, I want to implore you to hold to the absolute sovereignty of the living God. The living God who has power over all kingdoms, the powers over this earth, who has power over every detail of our lives. For this God is our hope. This God is our foundation for life. Let's pray together, shall we? For our God, we thank you that in the midst of this uncertain days, that you walk with us. Not only do you walk with us, but you carry us. And our God, we confess that there have been times when we've reached out to grab for other idols, for other hopes to sustain us. We ask your forgiveness. Father, remind us again each day of your sovereignty. Remind us that we can reach out to you, can hold tight to you. For you are our God, the living God, the sovereign God. Amen.